For decades, the world echoed with a sound synonymous with joy, the laughter of Lucille Ball. But as the final curtain began to fall, that sound grew faint, swallowed by an encroaching silence. In its place, a quiet regret settled, culminating in a single, unguarded moment. A moment during her very last interview that would expose the profound sadness she had concealed behind the comedian's mask. The woman who sat before the camera was not the vibrant, fiery redhead the world remembered. This was someone else, a figure whose shoulders seemed to carry the immense weight of a lifetime of unparalleled success, of shattering heartbreak, and the quiet, gnawing feeling of being a relic in the very world she had helped to create. The words she spoke that day would leave the studio crew, and millions watching at home, in stunned, tearful silence, witnessing the final act of the lonely queen of comedy. By the year 1989, the name Lucille Ball was still etched in the stone of legend, but the life it represented had lost its luster. The woman who once commanded an audience of 44 million viewers every single Monday night was now living a life of quiet, gilded isolation. Her sprawling Beverly Hills mansion, a place that once rang with laughter and the clinking glasses of Hollywood royalty, had grown still and cold. The familiar faces of old friends were mostly memories. Her children, Lucy and Desi Jr., had built lives far from her orbit, their visits becoming increasingly rare. And while her second husband, Gary Morton, remained a loyal presence, he would later speak of a persistent sadness that hung in the air of that great house. A profound melancholy that no amount of fame or fortune could ever dispel. To the world, Lucille was America's sweetheart, an icon of pure joy. But behind the closed doors of her own home, she was a woman haunted by ghosts of the past. The devastating failure of Life with Lucy in 1986 had dealt a critical blow to her spirit. She had stepped out of a well-earned retirement, convinced she could remind the world, and perhaps herself, that the magic was still there. Instead, the show was unceremoniously pulled from the air after a mere 8 episodes. For the first time in a career spanning half a century, the audience simply didn't laugh. The critics were merciless, calling it a painful, even tragic, farewell. Those close to her said Lucy took the failure to heart. They spoke of long, sleepless nights, where she would sit alone, rereading the scathing reviews, the words on the page questioning if the magic had finally, truly vanished. But this was more than just a cancelled sitcom. It felt like a verdict on something far deeper, a sign that time itself had moved on without her. It was as if Hollywood, the kingdom she had once ruled, had forgotten its queen. A new generation of comedians, many of whom she had personally inspired, now dominated the airwaves, yet the phone rarely rang. The trailblazer who had shattered barriers for women in entertainment now found herself alone, a solitary figure watching black and white reruns of I Love Lucy in the dim light of her living room. Sometimes, a soft, familiar laugh would escape her lips, only to be followed by the silent act of wiping a tear from her eye. And it wasn't just her spirit that was faltering. Physically, she was beginning to fade. A lifetime of smoking had taken its toll on her lungs, and by 1988, the first signs of heart trouble emerged. Yet, she refused to acknowledge any weakness. "I'm fine," she would insist to her nurse, even on days when the short walk to the kitchen was an exhausting effort. When friends pleaded with her to slow down, her reply was always the same: "I don't know how to stop." It was the very same stubborn will that had forged an empire. But now, in the twilight of her life, it was all she had left. To understand the iron in her soul, one must look back to the early heartbreaks that shaped her. Lucille Desiree Ball was born on August 6, 1911, a small-town girl from Jamestown, New York, destined to one day sit on the throne of Hollywood. But her story did not begin in a world of sunshine and laughter. She was only 3 years old when the first great tragedy of her life struck. Her father, a telephone lineman named Henry Ball, was struck down by a sudden illness. Typhoid fever. In the weeks leading up to his death, he had been out in the bitter cold, climbing telephone poles slick with snow, working to repair wires mangled by a brutal winter storm. His body gave out quickly. On February 28, 1915, he was gone, at just 27 years of age. The memory of that day would be seared into Lucille's mind forever. Not as a clear narrative, but as a series of haunting snapshots, Her mother's inconsolable cries, a picture inexplicably falling from a wall, and the frantic, desperate fluttering of a small bird that had somehow become trapped inside the house. That single image would become the source of a terror that would follow her for the rest of her life. From that day forward, she developed a profound ornithophobia, a fear not only of birds themselves, but of anything that even suggested their form. Paintings, photographs, even fabric patterns. Friends would later recall how she would refuse to set foot in a hotel room if the wallpaper bore the image of a bird, a strange and secret wound from a day of unimaginable loss. For Lucille, this was never just a superstition. It was the echo of a grief she could never outrun. Her mother, Dede, was hardly more than a girl herself, and deeply overwhelmed, pregnant with Lucille's younger brother, Fred. In an act of sheer survival, she sent Lucille to be raised by relatives while she fought to piece their lives back together. Lucy grew up in the shadow of that decision, feeling like a perpetual guest in her own family. When her mother remarried a man named Ed Peterson, the coldness only deepened. His parents were figures of strict, unsmiling authority who banned all mirrors from the house, lest the children be tempted by vanity. Lucy would later say those years were her first acting school, where she learned to wear a mask of contentment. Then, when Lucy was 12, a second tragedy struck, one that would irrevocably alter their lives. Her stepfather had set up a modest target range in the backyard. He was a careful man, but on one fateful day, a terrible accident occurred. A young neighbor boy was hit by a stray shot. The bullet lodged in his spine, leaving him paralyzed for life. The subsequent lawsuit was devastating. The family lost everything. Their home, their furniture, even the security of their insurance was stripped away. Weighed down by an unbearable guilt, Lucy's grandfather never worked another day. As she would later recount, one accident destroyed us. This is the story of the rise and the profound pain behind I Love Lucy. By the time Lucille Ball reached her late 20s, she had tasted rejection far more often than success. Her dream of the stage had begun in New York, only to be swiftly crushed by the very teachers at the John Murray Anderson School for the Dramatic Arts, who flatly informed her she possessed no talent. One instructor even dismissed her completely, advising her mother not to waste any more money on lessons. Years later, Lucy would look back on that searing humiliation as the crucible that hardened her resolve. "All I learned there," she once admitted, "was how to be frightened." But she refused to break. She returned to New York in 1928, taking modeling jobs to survive, before finally heading west, drawn by the siren call of Hollywood in the 1930s. There, she became a familiar face on studio lots, earning the title Queen of the B-movies. She appeared in more than 75 films, typically cast as a chorus girl, the witty sidekick, or the woman who never quite captured the spotlight. Still, she remained a diligent student of her craft. Each film set was a lesson in timing, posture, and control. The camera sensed a magic in her that the industry had yet to fully embrace. Then, in 1940, her world tilted on its axis. During the filming of Too Many Girls, she encountered a magnetic young Cuban musician named Desi Arnaz. He was a storm of confidence, charm, and pure unpredictability. They met on set, danced in the moments between takes, and within a few short months, they eloped in Connecticut. A chorus of voices warned it would never last, and in many ways, those voices were prophetic. Desi drank to excess, kept late hours, and possessed a notoriously wandering eye. For Lucy, who had yearned her entire life for stability, it was a plunge back into chaos. But her love for him ran deep, rooted in the belief that if they could build something together, they might just save each other from their demons. That very belief would give birth to I Love Lucy. In 1951, when CBS offered to adapt Lucy's radio show, My Favorite Husband, for television, she laid down one unshakable condition. Desi had to be cast as her on-screen husband. The network balked, arguing that audiences would never accept an interracial couple, but Lucy refused to yield. To prove the executives wrong, she and Desi crafted a live vaudeville tour. The chemistry that ignited between them on stage was undeniable, and a chastened CBS finally relented. The show that followed became a cultural touchstone, Every Monday night, America paused to watch Lucy and Ricky Ricardo. At its peak, I Love Lucy drew in 44 million viewers, more people than tuned in for the presidential inauguration. Lucy's singular comic genius, her absolute fearlessness in sacrificing her dignity for a laugh, and her flawless timing made her the undisputed face of television comedy. But behind the curtain of laughter, her real-life marriage was slowly coming apart. Desi's infidelities wore on. And with every whispered rumor she fought to disregard, a small piece of Lucy's heart fractured. In the warm glow of the studio lights, they were the picture of American perfection, but when the set went dark, she was left to weep in the shadows. To be the wife of Desi Arnaz was a burden carried in silence. It was an endless cycle. She would later confess the drink, the other women. Yet she remained, clinging to the fragile hope that their love could somehow outlast the blinding glare of fame. And for a time, it seemed it might. But by 1957, when the final curtain fell on I Love Lucy, the fissures in their union had become chasms, too vast to conceal any longer. A nation had fallen for Lucy and Ricky Ricardo, but behind the laughter, the real Lucille Ball was silently unraveling, caught between private heartache and a looming public disgrace, the Red Scare. In the early 1950s, a chilling paranoia descended upon America, a fear capable of obliterating a lifetime's work in a single news cycle. This was the age of Senator Joseph McCarthy and the infamous Hollywood blacklist, a time when the merest whisper of communist ties could extinguish a star's light forever. And for Lucille Ball, the undisputed queen of television, that very fear came crashing into her world in the year 1953. It started as they always do, a ghost on the airwaves, a veiled insinuation from the powerful columnist Walter Winchell, speaking of a certain famous redhead with a secret political past. He never uttered her name. He didn't have to. The following morning, the nation awoke to stark, screaming headlines. Printed in crimson ink, Lucille Ball named Red. In the span of a single day, America's sweetheart had become a person of national suspicion. The root of this accusation lay buried in the past, a decision made nearly 2 decades prior. In 1936, a young Lucille had registered to vote as a member of the Communist Party. It was not a political statement, but an act of love for her grandfather, a man of deeply held socialist convictions. He wanted me to do it to please him, she would later recount. So I did. She never went to a single meeting. She never spoke of politics, and the act itself faded from her memory. But in the fever pitch of the Cold War, some things are never truly forgotten, and that distant, forgotten choice now stood to dismantle the empire she had built. For Lucille, the timing was a catastrophe. I Love Lucy was mid-production on a new season. Sponsors, like the powerful Philip Morris, were panicked. Millions of dollars hung in the balance. If her audience, her loyal public, were to turn against her, the entire Desilu Studios empire she and Desi had forged could crumble into dust overnight. But Lucille Ball did not run. She chose to confront the storm directly, voluntarily appearing before investigators from the dreaded House Un-American Activities Committee, a committee notorious for its merciless interrogations that had broken actors, writers, and directors. With quiet composure, she laid out the simple truth. She explained that the registration was solely to appease her grandfather, that she had never once cast a ballot as a communist, and that her life was an open book. I have never been a communist, she declared. I have never been involved in anything subversive. In my entire life. As the world held its breath, anticipating her fall, Desi Arnaz moved decisively. He summoned the press to their home. Then, before the live taping of a new episode, he stepped onto the soundstage, looked directly into the heart of the audience, and spoke. "The only thing red about Lucy is her hair," he announced, his voice ringing with defiance, "and even that's not legitimate." But then, to the astonishment of all, he revealed he had personally spoken with the most powerful man in law enforcement, FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover, who had given his official word. Lucille Ball was cleared. The studio audience erupted in a wave of thunderous applause. But while one fire was extinguished, another was just beginning to burn. The slow, painful breakdown of a family, the scandals, and the toll it would take, all in the years after 1957. Lucille Ball had become the most powerful woman in television, At the helm of Desilu Productions, she and Desi presided over a studio that would birth timeless classics, like Star Trek and Mission Impossible. Yet, the very success that had once been the glue of their marriage, it was now the force that was tearing them apart. The arguments became legendary, loud, vicious, and unending. As Lucille herself would later admit, we weren't fighting for love anymore. It had become a battle for survival. On the 3rd of March, 1960, a day heavy with irony, just 24 hours after Desi's birthday and the final bittersweet wrap of their last show together, the papers were filed. 2 months later, the curtain fell. A 20-year love story, a Hollywood institution, was officially declared over. The news sent shockwaves across the globe. For millions, they weren't just actors, they were Lucy and Ricky Ricardo, the very embodiment of love and laughter in post-war America. But beyond the glow of the studio lights, a much darker script had been playing out. Lucille had endured years of whispered betrayals, the clinking of ice in a glass too late at night, and an emotional exhaustion that had worn her soul thin. In a moment of stark, haunting clarity, Desi would later confess, "I was the cause of it. My drinking, my temper. I ruined the best thing that ever happened to me." And yet, even in the ashes of their marriage, the ties that bound them, love and commerce, remained unbreakable. Lucy, in a move that would redefine Hollywood, bought his shares of Desilu for a staggering $2.5 million, becoming the first woman to ever helm a major Hollywood studio, a titan in a world of men. But the throne brought no peace. In 1961, she found a new partner in comedian Gary Morton. He was a kind, patient man, 13 years her junior, a calm harbor after a lifelong storm. Their marriage would last until her final days, but it was a different kind of love, a quieter echo of the fire she'd known with Desi. She confided in a friend, "Gary gave me stability, but Desi gave me fire." She had moved on, but a part of her soul had never truly left him. Their children, Lucy and Desi Jr., grew up in the long, eclipsing shadow of their parents' legend. Lucy followed the path to the stage, while Desi Jr. wrestled with his own demons. His struggles splashed across the covers of every tabloid. In the early 1970s, his tumultuous romance with actress Patty Duke ignited a media firestorm. The affair created a vortex of chaos, and when Duke announced she was pregnant, the whispers became a roar. Desi Jr. was the father. For Lucille, the news was a devastating blow. It was a public spectacle, a humiliation that threatened to drag the family name, her name, through the mire. Years would pass before a DNA test revealed the truth, but the scar tissue had already formed. The damage was done. Lucille retreated, pulling the walls in tighter around her, burying herself in her work, a desperate attempt to protect the carefully constructed image of her family. And then, another crack appeared in her world. Vivian Vance, her Ethel, her on-screen sidekick, her off-screen confidant, received a grim diagnosis: cancer. Lucille remained by her side, a constant presence until the very end. When Vivian passed in 1979, a part of Lucille's own light was extinguished. She was inconsolable. "Part of me died with her," she whispered to Carol Burnett, one of the few friends who remained in her inner circle. The final phone call was yet to come. In the cold November of 1986, the telephone rang. It was the call Lucille Ball had been dreading for months. On the other end of the line was news of Desi Arnaz, the man who was her first love, her partner in creation, her history. He was dying. Lung cancer had laid its final claim, and his time was running out. Decades of distance and new lives had done nothing to sever the cord between them. Lucille had never stopped caring. Through the years there were phone calls, letters, and now, in his final days, a quiet pilgrimage. She flew to Del Mar to see him one last time. Their daughter, Lucy, would later recall the profound tenderness of those last visits. There was laughter through tears, and quiet moments that spoke of a forgiveness that transcended a lifetime of pain. Then, on November 30th, the date of their wedding anniversary, Lucy phoned him one last time. She held the receiver to her father's ear. "Say what you want to say," she urged her mother. But all Lucille could summon were 3 simple words, the same 3 that had been the foundation of their entire world. From the very beginning. "I love you," she repeated, the words a prayer. And from his bedside, Desi, frail but lucid, whispered back, "I love you too, honey. Good luck with your show." 2 days later, on the 2nd of December, 1986, Desi Arnaz was gone. He was 69 years old. For Lucille, it was as if the last great light in her universe had been extinguished. And yet, just 5 days after his death, Lucille Ball walked onto the stage at the Kennedy Center Honors in Washington, D.C. She had intended to stay home, lost in her grief, but her family had insisted she go. Then, in the middle of the ceremony, a silhouette emerged onto the stage, the actor, Robert Stack. In his hands, he clutched a letter from Desi. It had been written just days before his passing, a final message timed perfectly for her moment of honor. With a heavy reverence, Stack began to read. His voice carried Desi's words. "The New York Times asked me to divide the credit for I Love Lucy. I told them, give Lucy 90% of the credit, and divide the other 10% among the rest of us. Lucy Times was Times the show. Viv, Fred, and I were just props. Damn good props, but props nevertheless. P.S. I Love Lucy was never just a title." And as those words hung in the air, the camera found Lucy's face. The composure she had mastered for a lifetime began to fracture. Her hands trembled, her eyes flooding with tears as her second husband, Gary Morton, held her hand in a desperate grip. Nearby, President Ronald Reagan and First Lady Nancy Reagan looked on, witnesses to this profoundly public display of private history. For the first time, the world saw Lucille Ball, the titan of comedy, surrender to her grief. A wave of shared sorrow washed over the entire theater. It was the most fitting tribute imaginable. Desi's final words to Lucy, a love letter delivered from beyond the veil, disguised as a final farewell. A few years slipped by. In 1989, she sat for her final television interview. Her frame was more delicate, her voice a softer echo of its former power, but the sharp wit in her eyes remained. When asked what she wanted to be remembered for, she took a long pause, a lifetime of memories flickering behind her eyes, before saying quietly, "For making people happy." A profound silence fell upon the room. A faint, knowing smile touched her lips as she added, "That's all I ever wanted." It was an answer of breathtaking simplicity, yet it carried the immense weight of a life lived in the spotlight. Months later, her heart, which had brought so much joy to the world, began to fail. She fought, underwent surgery, and for a fleeting moment, it seemed she had won. But on April 26, 1989, her heart gave out. She was 77 years old. The story of Lucille Ball reminds us that even the most brilliant stars cast the longest shadows. Do you believe the world ever truly grasped the full measure of her genius and her sacrifice? Share your reflections with us in the comments. And if you still love Lucy as deeply as we do, please honor her memory with a like and subscribe as we continue to unearth more of Hollywood's untold stories.